What's up? Happy Thursday, March 12th. March 12th. Happy Thursday. And today I'm coming live to, of course, continue the topic of future of work. And I hope you're doing well. I hope you checked out my last lives. And today's topic is really going to just focus on the importance of remote work and why remote work is essential to economical and business success, especially when we're looking at different climate crises, AI everywhere, rising costs, and the world has moved. The world has shifted. The world has shifted since, pre-pandemic, but a lot of businesses and a lot of societies have not wanted to move forward, just overall leadership has been clinging to the archaic ways of how we go about in society, of how we go about just operations as a whole. I mean, if we really, really think about it, the technology has always been there for us to operate remotely. I mean, globalization really began pretty much in the 90s, right? The idea of looking to outsource talent to work across borders and boundaries that has always been there. The tools and technologies as well have always been there. I mean, when we look at how military operates, it's operating basically and essentially as a remote workforce. So it has never been understood as to why remote work has always been viewed as this bad thing, because it has always been essential since those types of technology have been a thing. And even if we really look at even down into the boom, industrial boom, and even when we go down to the cable and communication with cable, how those types of ways of communicating were forms of remote work. So it has never really made any sense except for leadership to hold on and cling on to the need for power and the need to hold on to these best practices of how work should be conducted. And that's why it gives me the face. Like, why aren't we moving forward? Why are we holding on to these ideas? All because and for the sake of micromanagement. Micromanagement in many ways, not just with butts and seats, right? But just with really trusting how work is being done. And we really have to recognize that in order for work, since every type of work is deemed as essential when it comes to corporations, they don't like to not call what they do essential, right? So if it's essential, why are we not looking at ways for it to be easier and more flexible? And that's where leadership falls apart. It is not leading the way by ensuring that there's all ways and opportunities of working, which is remote work. We've done it pre-pandemic through, as I mentioned, all forms of communication, and highlighting that is how military operations are conducted. That's a form of remote work. So to say that it can't be and isn't a thing and isn't something that's beneficial is not true. And as we look at how all of these things are going about now with all the wars and the war going on and all this and that, what does that mean? Well, when we look at, what does that mean for how we go about operating? I mean, I think one good example is how we're seeing how, a lot of corporations and countries rely on fuel, oil. And we're noticing, and it's kind of a big duh with everything going on, that oil is something that sadly we're still relying on as if renewable energies is not a thing. But I digress. Here we are relying on the need for oil, right? Well, Thailand and Vietnam are now pushing for remote work in order to save energy. And I'm over here with that same face, my face, my face. Let's see, I got to keep switching back because I have so many pictures. One second. I'm still over here with the face. Like, what? Why are we doing this? It's so strange how, as I've been saying, how leadership can get stuck on this idea of, oh, that's not working. Let's go back and start back over, when really remote work should have never been removed from the workplace. It should never have been viewed as something that was not necessary because we're no longer in the pandemic, as if remote work was never an essential thing and something that always should have been continuously invested in. And that falls down to bad leadership. We should not have to move back into the idea that, oh, maybe we should go back to remote work because there's a war. It should not have to be that, right? It should have already been that been essential and been used and continue to be a part of how business operates, how government operates, how societies move and operate. Yes, it is understood that not every business can operate using remote work, or same certain industries you cannot do that. Yes, that is understandable and we get that. But the idea that remote work should have never been a thing because we're no longer in a pandemic is just bad business. It's actually just ignorance, really. It's really just ignorance and holding on to the archaic idea of how businesses should operate when remote work is essential. It is essential. It is a tool. It is a way for us to be more efficient and effective. And that's not just for business operations, but for the needs of employees and the humans within the workspace. Remote work is for that, right? Because if we look at it, yeah, it's about saving energy, but it's also about the stress and the burden that it's also putting on work on employees to get to the job, right? And to, get to the job, to get back home, even how they're operating within their homes, we're not looking at that, and how we cannot look at how when people work remotely, that's one thing that's done is people think that people that work remotely should be paid less. And this is an example where this highlights that no, it should not be. Because if I'm working from home, that means I'm using more energy in my home versus more energy within the workspace. So regardless, you cannot reduce how people are paid just because they work remotely. That is one lesson as well that needs to be mentioned. But also, regardless of that, remote work allows for that reduced burden, as I mentioned, because it's less money on gas, unpaid time in traffic, which leads to stress, more capacity of people to show up with actual energy instead of exhaustion. It's so much research that has highlighted this and showed this. So I think that Thailand and Vietnam are bringing the full circle moment back for how we should be operating as leaders within our businesses and within society as well. Of course, here in America, remote work is deemed like a bad thing from many Fortune 500 companies and many larger corporations. You hear so much demonizing of remote work as if it is not something that is essential, and that all boils back to that ideology of controlling how people work, controlling who is it within the workspace. And if you're in the workspace, it's assumed that you are being effectively performing. Just because you're in the workspace doesn't mean you're actually working. Just because you're in the workplace doesn't mean that the work that you're doing is actually contributing to the business overall. It's just an assumption because you are viewed. I can see you, but me looking at you does not mean that you are actually contributing, and that what you're contributing is actually resulting in some meaningful change. But for some reason, that is not understood all the time, and it's viewed as if you're not present and I cannot see you as a leader, it's assumed that the work that you are doing is not effective and is not contributing, or that for some reason, if you're not contributing the way I deem you should, you're not operating effectively because I cannot see you. These are lessons that need to be learned, and it's really just resisting modern work design. And that's something that makes no sense. That's how leaders can dump billions into the needs for AI and the desire for AI, but not wanting to move forward with the use of remote work. That makes no sense. Remote work is a modernized way of working. Utilizing AI and new technologies is a modern way of working. So it really doesn't make any sense that we could have investments in AI and other modern technologies, but view a modern tool of remote work operations and tools and things like that, remote technology, as something that's not essential in contributing to the business's bottom line. And I know there's a lot of studies out there where it is viewed as though remote work doesn't work for everyone. Not everyone feels that they can be effective. And there's even been a study, I think it was in Gallup, I think it was Gallup that conducted a study where it showed that the younger generations that are coming forward, they prefer not to have remote work setting and want to be in person because they like the idea of interacting with other people. Now, there is still ways to go about that. That also leads into leadership and how true effective leadership should allow for people to not feel as though they aren't included, or there isn't a team or a true sense of human connection when there's remote work. That is all on how you're leading, how you're structuring, how you're communicating and including, everyone within the workspace so that everyone feels included and is recognized for their contributions and actually valued for how they are working. That's where real leadership shows up. That is what determines if your remote work operations or how your business or how governments are operating. If it's not operating on a clear form of true leadership that is built on inclusivity and the understanding of communicating with humans, because that's what leadership is about, the ability to motivate and influence and build confidence and help people to recognize, where they can be greater. That's what leadership is about. And if you're not able to do that as a good leader, then you don't need to be in that leadership position first and foremost. And you definitely don't have the skills and the competency to help move your workspace forward, to move society forward as someone in government or within private sector or just in your local community or wherever. If you don't have that essential skill, you don't even need to be thinking about how you're going to move forward anything within the modern workspace or the modern operations of how we are moving forward into the future with all of the technologies that everyone is hoping that we have. You can't have the same archaic leadership that we currently have. It's just not going to happen. You have to be able to embrace humans and embrace the differences of humans and how people who don't think like you and accept the things that you feel should be accepted. You can't just push them out, because that's where you're missing out on innovation. That's where you're missing out on, the true aspect of humans. And that's what makes us great. Us being different, us learning to work together. And that's where true leadership comes in. And that's where the recognition of how to build a strong, stable framework and structure within governments and society and corporations to even have remote work or to even have a modern design of working. But this example with Thailand and Vietnam is definitely highlighting and leading the way for people to recognize, leaders to recognize, governments to recognize, corporations, because mind you, has a lot of corporations that are in Thailand and Vietnam, and how they're going to look at how this idea of, oh, yeah, we could do remote work, right? Because so many people have moved away from that. It's strange. I don't know why, but how we look to them, and it's going to lead the way to influence other countries to do the same. This is something that should have never not been since the pandemic has happened, since the pandemic. But, for some reason, everyone feels that we need to move backwards instead of forward. If remote work was already in place, there would be no need to fear how to operate efficiently and effectively when things like wars and pandemics happen. We would already be utilizing these forms of technology. But no, for the sake of leaders feeling they need to control everything instead of trusting in the workforce and recognizing that the people that you have hired have the capabilities to carry out the operations that you have placed them in the positions to do. They've been hired because they are competent. So it is important and imperative for leaders to recognize that the people you hired are competent. And if they aren't, then that's where you come in the reprimandation and all of that, and the accountability is implemented. Other than that, there's no need to micromanage, because remote work is here to stay. Remote work is essential, and it's proving now as we are living in this new normal yet again, these constant new normals of how the world is changing from energy costs, different natural disasters and things like that have been happening, and just all the changes within society economically and socially, and how corporations are shifting and moving and new technologies are being implemented. It's only right that you recognize that remote work is here to stay. The data proves it. The bottom lines of many corporations proves it. And as we see, I mean, even with different laws that are being implemented, especially here in America with how it's going about when it comes to immigration, it's highlighting as well why remote work is deemed essential. Because there are people all over the world that have the skills that are deemed essential right now, but many of them where we live may not have them. And that's where remote work comes in, building and collaborating and and hiring from all over the world and structuring your businesses and your governments. Now, government's a different story when it comes to that, but the idea for how corporations can go about with that, it's kind of obvious, and it shows the need for leadership to move forward in a better way and to not fear that. And honestly, Thailand and Vietnam are reading the room. They are not falling victim or being held back. They're being proactive. They're not letting what's going on in the world stop how they move and operate. And that's something that we all need to do. How can we proactively go about not being impacted in some way? That's what it's all about. Constantly changing and evolving, even if we have to go back and utilize the same steps and approaches that we've used before. But this time, it's important to learn from the past so that we can move forward more creatively and more effectively into the future. And that's a lesson that should be learned and should have been learned pre-pandemic, then post-pandemic, to now where we are now. It should never have to be, oh, what do we need to do? What if this happens? What if that happens? It should already be deemed essential. It's been proven as it is essential, so it never should have never been that way. I don't know. It's something to think about. It's always something when it comes to how leaders move about and holding on to archaic ideas, and how these archaic ideas all deemed from the need for power because it's a systemic structure and framework. All relating back to my first talks, if you check them out in February, all from the past, all with the idea that micromanagement and the need for control are the key to business success, when really the key to business success is the human, the employee, and that's what moves profits. That's what drives business. And when you look at government, the key is humans, us within society. We move and drive change. We represent why we put leaders in office and why this world is moving in the way that it's moving. So, something to remember and something to recognize. Even though we sometimes are not deemed essential, we are essential, and we are the key to success. Us humans, we are the true drivers of performance, profits, and change within society. And with that being said, don't forget to be the change, love yourself and others. Check out my other videos, and I will see you later. Bye.